In the spring of 1941, while much of Japan celebrated its rapid expansion into China and Southeast Asia, one man within the Imperial Navy remained uneasy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, knew America in ways few of his peers did. He had lived in the United States, studied its industry, and walked the streets of its cities. He had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, learning fluent English and observing the depth of American culture. Later, as naval attaché in Washington, he traveled by train through the Midwest, where he saw factories churning out automobiles by the thousands. To most Japanese officers, America was a distant and decadent giant. To Yamamoto, it was a nation with resources so vast they seemed limitless. That knowledge haunted him. Yamamoto was no ordinary admiral. He was not a brash fire-eater demanding endless conquests, nor a timid bureaucrat eager to yield before superior numbers. He was a realist bound by loyalty. In private, he confided doubts about the Empire's future war with the West. "If I am told to fight," he once warned, "I shall run wild for 6 months, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." This was not false modesty. It was the studied calculation of a man who had watched oil refineries in Texas and steel foundries in Pittsburgh, who understood that Japan, with its fragile economy and limited natural resources, could not match America's production base in a long war. Yet in 1941, the machinery of politics left him no choice. Japan's military leadership demanded an advance into Southeast Asia to secure oil and rubber. The United States opposed this expansion with embargoes, tightening the noose around Japan's energy supply. Without oil, the Imperial Navy would grind to a halt within months. Yamamoto, though skeptical of war, understood the brutal logic. If conflict was inevitable, Japan's only chance lay in delivering a devastating opening blow, one so shocking that America might sue for peace before its factories could fully mobilize. Thus, the blueprint for Pearl Harbor began to take shape. The plan was audacious. A carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, would steam undetected across the North Pacific, launching a dawn assault on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at anchor in Hawaii. The goal was not simply destruction, it was paralysis. By sinking battleships, crippling carriers, and wiping out airfields, Yamamoto hoped to buy Japan the 6-month breathing space he had warned of. Within that window, Japanese forces would overrun the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, securing the oil and raw materials necessary to wage war. Negotiations might then force the United States to accept a new Pacific balance. Few within the Japanese Navy questioned the plan's brilliance. Yamamoto was idolized as a strategist who fused boldness with precision. He had long advocated for the use of naval air power, often clashing with older officers who still worshipped the battleship. In secret war games and staff meetings, he pushed for carrier warfare as the decisive tool of the future. At Pearl Harbor, he intended to prove it. But behind the confidence lay vulnerability. The entire operation depended on absolute secrecy. If the Americans knew of the strike in advance, the carrier task force could be intercepted and annihilated far from home. For this reason, Japanese planners placed immense faith in their communications security. The Imperial Navy's encrypted system, designated JN-25, was considered impenetrable. It used 5-digit code groups layered with additive numbers, a cipher so complex that even seasoned mathematicians within Japan believed no foreign service could hope to untangle it quickly enough to matter. "Our signals," one staff officer later recalled, "were protected by a wall of silence the enemy could never breach." Yamamoto shared this confidence. While he worried constantly about Japan's lack of oil and industry, he rarely questioned the safety of his communications. The idea that an American officer in some basement office in Pearl Harbor or Washington could strip away the veil of JN-25 seemed to him absurd. The Japanese Navy's entire operational culture rested upon meticulous planning, precise timetables, and rigid coordination across thousands of miles of ocean. Without secure signals, the entire edifice would crumble. He trusted in the mathematics of secrecy. The irony, of course, was that Yamamoto's greatest strengths, his daring reliance on maneuver, deception, and lightning warfare, were also his greatest vulnerabilities. By scattering fleets across the Pacific in elaborate operations, he created patterns that could be detected. By insisting on detailed radio transmissions to maintain control, he increased the volume of traffic flowing through JN-25. Each message, to Japanese eyes an indecipherable string of numbers, was in fact a fragment of the larger picture, waiting for patient minds to reconstruct. As autumn turned to winter in 1941, Yamamoto pressed his subordinates hard. He demanded rigorous secrecy drills, rehearsals, and absolute commitment. His leadership style was both paternal and severe. Officers respected him, but they also feared his sharp tongue and unbending standards. Within the inner circle of the combined fleet, there was no room for dissent. The Pearl Harbor plan would be executed exactly as ordered. And so, on December 7, 1941, as Japanese carrier aircraft roared down upon Oahu, Yamamoto's gamble was put to the test. From his flagship Nagato in Hashirajima anchorage, he listened grimly to the radio reports. Battleships burning, airfields smashed, hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground. The strike had exceeded even his expectations. Yet his reaction was not triumph, but unease. "I fear," he is said to have remarked, "all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." That remark, whether precisely worded or not, captures Yamamoto's mindset. He had achieved his 6 months of running wild, but he knew the limits of Japan's power better than anyone. What he did not know, what he could not yet admit, was that the Americans were already probing the supposed fortress of JN-25. Even in December 1941, codebreakers at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor and OP-20G in Washington were filing intercepts, grinding through strings of 5-digit numbers. Progress was slow, fragmentary, but steady. The fate of Yamamoto himself and of his grand design for Pacific dominance would eventually be sealed not by ships or aircraft, but by the men in those basement rooms, men he never believed could touch his codes. In the cramped, windowless basement of an old Pearl Harbor administration building, a handful of young Americans bent over typewriters, graph paper, and radio intercepts. The room smelled of ink, sweat, and stale coffee. Its occupants were not warriors in the traditional sense. They carried no rifles, wore no medals, and lived far from the headlines of battleships and carriers. Yet these men, and a few women working beside them, would wage one of the most decisive struggles of the Pacific War, the war against JN-25, the Japanese Navy's primary code. This place was Station HYPO, the U.S. Navy's cryptologic unit in Hawaii. Its leader, Commander Joseph J. Rochefort, was an unlikely hero. Thin, sharp-featured, usually dressed in a threadbare smoking jacket instead of a uniform, Rochefort often appeared more like a tired schoolteacher than a naval officer. But behind his eccentric appearance lay a razor intellect and a burning intensity. He had studied Japanese for years, and his ear for nuance in language made him invaluable. His men revered him, even if outsiders thought him unorthodox. Rochefort's war was fought in silence. Every day, radio operators at listening posts from the Aleutians to the Philippines copied streams of Japanese naval traffic. These were not plain words, but blocks of numbers, each 5 digits long, enciphered with complex additives. To the Japanese, JN-25 was unbreakable. To Rochefort and his team, it was a puzzle with missing pieces, waiting to be solved through patience, logic, and intuition. They were not alone. On the other side of the Pacific, in Washington, D.C., the Navy's OP-20G code-breaking unit laboured in similar fashion. There, Commander John Redman and his staff tackled the same intercepts. But it was Rochefort's team in Hawaii, closer to the Pacific Theatre, that felt the urgency most keenly. Every scrap of intelligence might mean the difference between ambush and survival for American sailors. Progress came slowly. The Americans could not simply solve JN-25 overnight. It was too vast, too layered. Instead, they chipped away, reconstructing the codebook piece by piece. Each time the Japanese repeated a phrase or reused an additive, a tiny crack appeared in the armour. One intercepted message might reveal only a word or two. Another might confirm a ship name or location. Day after day, the fragments accumulated, forming a mosaic of meaning. The work demanded obsession. Analysts scribbled furiously on pads of paper, marking repeated patterns, cross-referencing with known naval movements, guessing at possible Japanese phrases like, "I have the honour to report." It was less mathematics than detective work, and Rochefort encouraged his staff to trust intuition as much as calculation. "You'll know it when you see it," he often told them, urging persistence through frustration. By early 1942, the fruits of their labour began to ripen. At first, the insights were limited. Vague clues about convoys, hints of fleet deployments. But even partial decrypts provided an edge. When American ships intercepted Japanese supply runs or avoided sudden attacks, commanders often never knew that the warning had come from a room of sweating linguists and mathematicians poring over endless strings of digits. The stakes grew higher as Yamamoto pushed Japan's momentum outward. In the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces seemed unstoppable, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The empire reached its greatest territorial expanse. Just as Yamamoto predicted, Japan was running wild. But behind the surge, in the shadows, the American codebreakers were racing against time, knowing that if they could pierce JN-25 deeply enough, they might halt that momentum. It was a war of contrasts. Yamamoto relied on speed, secrecy, and surprise. Rochefort relied on patience, pattern, and probability. The admiral commanded carriers and battleships. The commander commanded pencils, dictionaries, and minds. Yet both men understood that victory in the Pacific hinged on foresight, on knowing where the enemy would strike next. The pressure weighed heavily on Rochefort. His team often worked 18-hour days, surviving on cigarettes and sandwiches. The Hawaiian sun rarely reached their underground chamber. The monotony was broken only by the occasional outburst of triumph when a breakthrough emerged, when a line of numbers suddenly revealed a word like carrier or Midway. Each victory was fleeting, for the Japanese constantly changed their additives, forcing the Americans to begin again. Still, progress mounted. By the spring of 1942, HYPO could read enough of JN-25 to provide intelligence of genuine strategic value. Small warnings began to appear on Admiral Chester Nimitz's desk, pointing to Japanese intentions. It was not yet a full picture, but it was enough to suggest patterns, to hint at coming storms. The irony was profound. Yamamoto, who had placed his faith in the invincibility of JN-25, unknowingly left the door ajar. His reliance on complex but rigid communications gave Rochefort just enough to work with. Each time a fleet manoeuvred, each time an operation was prepared, the chatter increased. And each time the Americans grew a little surer of where Japan would strike. The true test came in May and June of 1942. Messages began to speak of a major operation in the Central Pacific. The target was disguised under a code name, simply AF. Washington analysts argued about its meaning. Some thought it might be Hawaii again. Others pointed toward Fiji or Samoa. Rochefort, however, was convinced AF meant Midway, the tiny atoll guarding the approaches to Hawaii. To prove it, he devised a ruse. Midway's radio operators were instructed to send an uncoded message complaining of a broken water distillation plant. Soon afterward, a Japanese message was intercepted reporting that AF was short of water. The trap had worked. AF was Midway. That single deduction changed the course of the war. Nimitz now knew where Yamamoto intended to strike, and he could prepare an ambush of his own. The decisive Battle of Midway was about to unfold, not because of brute force, but because of the quiet brilliance of men labouring in a basement, piecing together fragments of an unbreakable code. The codebreakers themselves remained largely invisible. Their success was cloaked in secrecy, even from many fellow officers. Rochefort, modest and exhausted, downplayed his achievements, insisting his team had only done its duty. Yet by giving Nimitz the foresight to meet Yamamoto at Midway, they had altered the balance of the Pacific. The struggle against JN-25 did not end there. It would remain a running battle throughout the war, with the Japanese revising and complicating their system, and the Americans adapting in turn. But the critical truth had been established. No code was truly unbreakable. Patience, ingenuity, and relentless effort could turn numbers into victory. In the duel between Yamamoto and Rochefort, between the architect of Pearl Harbor and the quiet genius of Station HYPO, the seeds of Japan's reversal were sown. The admiral's faith in secrecy collided with the commander's faith in persistence, and in the dark months after Pearl Harbor, it was persistence that carried the day. The Japanese combined fleet moved toward the Central Pacific with absolute confidence. To Admiral Yamamoto, the plan was elegant in its complexity, a masterpiece of maneuver designed to lure the battered remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into destruction. Midway Atoll, tiny and isolated, would be the bait. Once the Americans rushed to defend it, his carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, would annihilate them. On paper, it was flawless. The Imperial Japanese Navy was still the strongest in the world. Its carrier pilots were battle-hardened veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, and the conquest of the Philippines. Yamamoto himself would be at sea aboard the mighty battleship Yamato, commanding the operation from afar. By late May 1942, the Japanese High Command believed victory inevitable. But in Pearl Harbor's underground rooms, the officers of Station HYPO knew the truth. Commander Joseph Rochefort had intercepted enough fragments of JN-25 to reveal the Japanese timetable and objective. His deception about Midway's broken water plant had confirmed the target. Now Rochefort's decrypts reached Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Nimitz was not a gambler by nature, but he recognized opportunity when it appeared. The intelligence gave him a priceless advantage. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States knew exactly where and when Japan would strike. Against an enemy superior in numbers, foreknowledge was everything. Nimitz quietly concentrated his surviving carriers, Enterprise and Hornet under Admiral Raymond Spruance, and the battered but still formidable Yorktown under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. The Yorktown had been heavily damaged just weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, but Pearl Harbor's repair crews worked around the clock, patching gaping holes, restoring flight decks, and making her seaworthy in less than 3 days. When she sailed to join the fleet, many of her welds were still warm. It was a desperate gamble, but Nimitz knew time was short. The Japanese were already at sea. By early June, Yamamoto's massive armada, over 200 ships, including 4 carriers and 11 battleships, advanced toward Midway, confident that surprise was on their side. What Yamamoto did not know was that surprise had been stolen from him weeks earlier. The Americans, thanks to Rochefort's team, lay hidden northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush. It was a reversal almost unimaginable to Yamamoto. He believed in the invincibility of JN-25. He believed the Americans were still reeling from Pearl Harbor. He believed his plan of feints and diversions would scatter enemy forces in confusion. He believed wrongly that he alone held the initiative. On the night of June 3, 1942, American patrol aircraft from Midway spotted the approaching invasion force. At dawn on June 4th, Japanese carrier aircraft struck the atoll, bombing its runways and installations. The defenders fought back with marine fighters and anti-aircraft fire, but Midway was badly hit. Still, the outpost endured, its runways scarred but functional. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Japanese carrier force, now faced a critical decision. His planes had inflicted damage, but not enough to neutralize Midway. Should he prepare a second strike against the atoll, or rearm his planes with torpedoes in case American ships appeared? Reports were confused. Nagumo hesitated, ordering bombs switched out, then reversed his orders as new information came in. The indecision consumed precious minutes. At that moment, American carrier aircraft, guided by Rochefort's intelligence, closed in. The first waves, torpedo squadrons flying obsolete Devastator bombers, were slaughtered almost to the last man. Entire squadrons disappeared into the sea under withering Japanese fire. Yet their sacrifice drew Japanese fighters down to low altitude, leaving the skies above momentarily unguarded. Then came the turning point. At 10:22 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared overhead, almost by chance after a difficult search. In minutes, the battle shifted from Japanese triumph to catastrophe. The dive bombers plunged through thin clouds and released their payloads onto Nagumo's carriers. Within 5 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were engulfed in fire, their decks crammed with fueled aircraft and explosives. Massive detonations tore through the ships, sending black columns of smoke into the sky. Only Hiryu remained, launching desperate counterattacks that crippled Yorktown. But later in the day, American dive bombers found her too. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers lay burning or sunk. The flawless plan had disintegrated. Yamamoto, far behind with the main battle fleet, never had the chance to intervene. His prized carriers, his striking arm, were gone, along with many of his most experienced pilots and deck crews. The loss stunned the Japanese high command. For Yamamoto, it was the bitter confirmation of the risks he had always known. His faith in JN-25 had blinded him to the possibility that the Americans might anticipate his moves. He had gambled everything on secrecy, and Rochefort's men had quietly broken that secrecy wide open. Midway was more than a naval battle. It was a turning point in the Pacific War. Japan had lost the initiative. From that moment forward, the Empire would fight defensively. Its resources stretched thin against an enemy that grew stronger each month. In Tokyo, official bulletins downplayed the defeat, but Yamamoto understood the truth. He had promised his government 6 months of running wild. Pearl Harbor in December, the Philippines in January, Singapore in February, the Dutch East Indies in March. But now, in June 1942, exactly 6 months later, his prediction had come true. Not in triumph, but in limitation. Japan's 6 months were over. For the men of Station HYPO, the victory at Midway remained secret. Few outside intelligence circles knew of their decisive role. Rochefort himself received little recognition at the time, his eccentric ways having earned him enemies in Washington. Yet those who understood saw clearly. Without the codebreakers, Nimitz would have faced Yamamoto blind, and Midway might have ended very differently. Midway was the battle where Yamamoto's genius met its limits, where secrecy failed, and where the quiet persistence of cryptanalysts turned numbers into destiny. For Yamamoto, it was the first step toward his own eventual fate. On the morning of April 14, 1943, a message pulsed through Japanese naval circuits. Encoded in JN-25, it outlined the inspection tour of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. The itinerary was precise: departure from Rabaul, flight path across Bougainville, times of arrival down to the minute. It was a simple schedule for the Empire's most celebrated admiral, yet in its precision lay his doom. At Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor and at Allied listening posts throughout the Pacific, radio operators captured the transmission. Within hours, fragments of the message were on the desks of American cryptanalysts. By now, after months of grueling work, JN-25 was vulnerable. Analysts reconstructed enough of the dispatch to leave no doubt Yamamoto would be airborne following a fixed route on April 18th. The revelation reached Admiral Chester Nimitz in Hawaii and General Douglas MacArthur in Australia almost simultaneously. It was explosive intelligence, the kind rarely encountered in war. To strike Yamamoto in transit would be to decapitate Japan's naval leadership in a single blow. Yet the decision carried weighty consequences. President Franklin Roosevelt was informed through secure channels. His reply was brief and emphatic. Get Yamamoto. Thus began the planning for Operation Vengeance, one of the most audacious missions of the Pacific War. The task fell to Admiral William F. Halsey, commander of the South Pacific. His staff and those of the 13th Fighter Command pored over Yamamoto's route. The admiral would travel in a formation of Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, escorted by Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. His flight would depart from Rabaul and follow a predictable line along Bougainville's jungle coast. The challenge? Intercepting him in the vastness of the Solomon Islands. The Americans had one weapon capable of the mission, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. With twin engines, long range, and heavy firepower, the P-38 could reach Bougainville from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Barely. No other Allied fighter had the range. Even for the P-38s, the mission would push endurance to the limit. Nearly 1,000 miles round trip over open ocean, navigated by stopwatch and compass. Major John W. Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron was chosen to lead. His pilots were hand-picked, 16 in all, most of them veterans of Guadalcanal's brutal air battles. They were sworn to secrecy. Not even their fellow squadrons knew the target. Mitchell carried a sealed envelope containing Yamamoto's flight schedule. Inside, the exact time. The Admiral's bomber would pass over Bougainville at 09:35 hours, April 18th. Every detail mattered. To conserve fuel, the P-38s would fly in radio silence at low altitude, skimming the sea at 50 feet to avoid detection. They would climb only at the last moment to meet the Japanese formation. Timing was critical. 1 minute early or late, and Yamamoto would slip past. On April 18th, at dawn, the 16 P-38s roared off Henderson Field. The takeoff was tense. If any engine faltered, the mission was at risk. But one by one, the lightnings lifted into the grey Pacific sky. The flight settled into its long, low approach. For 2 hours, the pilots stared at the glinting ocean, fighting fatigue, holding formation. The tropical heat pressed against their cockpits. Inside, each man wrestled with the weight of the mission, to kill the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man whose order had plunged their country into war. At 09:34 hours, just as predicted, Mitchell's formation reached Bougainville. Ahead, over the emerald jungle, specks appeared, 2 Betty bombers with 6 zeros circling above. Yamamoto's flight had arrived on schedule, as rigid in his punctuality as always. The Americans climbed sharply, engines straining. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber broke toward the bombers while others engaged the Zeros. The sky erupted in chaos, tracer fire, diving arcs, twisting fighters. Barber closed on the lead Betty. He pressed his triggers, sending streams of .50 caliber rounds into its engines and fuselage. Flames erupted. The bomber lurched, lost altitude, and crashed violently into the jungle canopy. Inside was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He died instantly, his body later found still seated, katana at his side. The second Betty attempted to escape but was pursued and shot down, smashing into the sea. Yamamoto's staff officers perished with it. The escorting Zeros fought valiantly, but the Americans, driven by grim resolve, forced them off. After minutes of fierce combat, Mitchell's formation turned back, racing the long journey home. Of the 16 Lightnings, 1 failed to return. but the mission had succeeded. Yamamoto was dead. News of the operation was initially kept secret. American authorities feared the Japanese would deduce their codes had been compromised. Public announcements merely reported that Yamamoto had died in combat. Only within inner circles did the truth circulate, that code-breaking had given the Americans a window into the Admiral's schedule, and precise timing had made the ambush possible. In Tokyo, Yamamoto's death was received with shock and mourning. Official bulletins portrayed him as a fallen hero, struck down in the line of duty. His funeral was a grand state ceremony, his ashes interred at Tama Cemetery. But among naval officers, grief mingled with unease. If Yamamoto could be killed in the air, none were safe. And if the Americans had known his movements, could it mean the codes were no longer secure? The question haunted Japanese intelligence. For the Allies, the mission's symbolism was immense. Yamamoto was more than an admiral. He was the embodiment of Japan's naval strategy, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had promised 6 months of victory. His death was both vengeance and turning point, a signal that Japan's aura of invincibility was ending. Among the pilots, feelings were complex. Lanfear and Barber each claimed credit for the kill, a dispute that lingered for decades. But all knew they had taken part in history. They had flown the longest, most precise fighter interception of the war, and achieved its most consequential ambush. Operation Vengeance revealed the convergence of 2 unseen forces, the persistence of American codebreakers and the daring of American pilots. Without Rochefort's men breaking JN-25, the ambush would never have been possible. Without the P-38s, no interception could have been attempted. Intelligence and technology, patience and courage, together they had reached into the heart of Japan's leadership and struck. For Yamamoto, the irony was profound. The man who had warned that Japan could not win a long war, who had urged secrecy as the empire's shield, was undone by that very secrecy betrayed. He had trusted JN-25 as invulnerable. But the Americans had cracked it wide open, and with it, his fate. The jungle of Bougainville held his final resting place. To his men, Yamamoto remained a revered figure, a symbol of loyalty and duty. To his enemies, his death was justice for Pearl Harbor. In truth, it was both, a reminder that war is fought not only with ships and guns, but with information, decisions, and timing. On April 18, 1943, at precisely 9:34 hours, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's war ended, and with him ended the illusion of Japanese invincibility in the Pacific. The news of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death spread slowly through the corridors of Japan's naval command. Official announcements spoke only of a hero struck down in combat, his spirit forever guiding the fleet. But inside the staff rooms of the Imperial Navy, the mood was darker. Officers whispered about how the Americans had managed such a precise interception. The Japanese had always trusted in JN-25, their intricate naval code, as a fortress of secrecy. Yet Yamamoto's fate suggested otherwise. Few dared voice the possibility aloud that their codes had been compromised. The Imperial Navy, steeped in tradition and discipline, resisted the idea that an enemy could outwit their cryptographers. Instead, they blamed coincidence, bad luck, or leaks from local sources. The comforting illusion of invulnerability lingered, but among Yamamoto's closest aides, unease grew. If the Americans truly read their signals, then no fleet movement was safe. For the Allies, Yamamoto's death confirmed something far greater than the elimination of one leader. It proved that signals intelligence, once dismissed as arcane, could alter the trajectory of the war. The ambush over Bougainville was not luck. It was the result of months of painstaking labour by codebreakers who turned streams of numbers into foresight. Operation Vengeance was the most dramatic proof yet that information, when seized and used with precision, was as deadly as bombs or torpedoes. In Washington, however, recognition came unevenly. Commander Joseph Rochefort, whose station HYPO had been instrumental in the victories at Midway and Yamamoto's interception, found himself sidelined. Bureaucratic rivalries within naval intelligence led to his reassignment to a shipyard, far from the cryptologic work at which he excelled. His superiors in Washington, jealous or skeptical, denied him the honours he deserved. Only decades later would Rochefort receive the Distinguished Service Medal, long after his death. Still, his team's work lived on in every American victory that followed. As the Pacific War stretched into 1944 and 1945, the Allies' grip on Japanese communications tightened. Newer versions of JN-25 were introduced, but the Americans cracked them again and again. By the time of the Marianas Campaign, and later the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Allied commanders often knew the outline of Japanese operations before the first shot was fired. Yamamoto's death had not ended the war of codes. It had marked the moment when the balance tipped irreversibly. For Japan, the loss of Yamamoto was more than symbolic. He had been not only the architect of Pearl Harbor, but also a moderating voice within the military. While loyal to his emperor and nation, Yamamoto had long understood the industrial might of the United States. He had warned before Pearl Harbor that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but beyond that the outcome was grim. His death removed a strategist who tempered the army's overconfidence with sober caution. The admirals who followed, Koga, Toyoda, and others, lacked his combination of boldness and restraint. Without Yamamoto's steady hand, Japanese naval strategy drifted, reactive rather than visionary. Yet even in defeat, Yamamoto's legacy endured among his men. His funeral in Tokyo drew throngs, his ashes borne with honour, his portrait hung in barracks across the empire. To many Japanese, he remained the warrior who had struck America at Pearl Harbor, a symbol of daring and resolve. To Americans, he was the embodiment of the enemy's cunning, an adversary finally outmanoeuvred in the very realm he had trusted most: secrecy. The broader legacy of Operation Vengeance extended beyond the Pacific. In the years after the war, military leaders worldwide studied the mission as a case study in intelligence-driven operations. It illustrated the new reality of modern war. No movement, no order, no plan could be considered secure once adversaries mastered the art of code-breaking. From Bletchley Park in Europe to Station HYPO in the Pacific, World War II had demonstrated that wars were not won by weapons alone, but by information. For the pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron, life moved on. Some, like Rex Barber, returned home to quiet lives, their role in Yamamoto's death overshadowed by debates about who had fired the fatal shots. Others carried the memory of April 18, 1943, as a defining moment of their service. The argument over credit persisted for decades, but the mission itself, the precision, the secrecy, the sheer audacity, remained one of the most remarkable feats of the war. Looking back, the irony was stark. Yamamoto, who had studied in the United States, who had walked Harvard Yard and toured American factories, had warned his nation never to underestimate American ingenuity. Yet it was precisely that ingenuity, applied not on the battlefield, but in the silent work of codebreakers, that sealed his fate. The admiral who had built his war plan on surprise was himself undone by surprise. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the lesson was unmistakable. Codes and secrecy, once thought unbreakable, were fragile. Wars were no longer won solely by fleets and armies, but by those who could read the enemy's intentions before they were acted upon. In this sense, Yamamoto's death was more than vengeance for Pearl Harbor. It was the proof that in the age of total war, knowledge was power, and power could kill as surely as any bullet. In the years following World War II, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's name lingered in both memory and myth. For Japan, he remained the face of daring, architect of Pearl Harbor, fallen warrior of the skies. For America, he was the symbol of a bold adversary, one who had dealt the nation its most humiliating blow and in turn received the most calculated retribution. But as the decades passed, Operation Vengeance came to be seen not only as a dramatic strike of war, but also as a moment heavy with ethical, cultural, and historical meaning. In Tokyo, post-war reflection on Yamamoto revealed a paradox. He had been fiercely loyal to the emperor and the navy, yet he had often resisted the reckless impulses of Japan's militarists. Before the war, Yamamoto had opposed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, recognizing that aligning against the United States would lead to disaster. He had warned Japan's leaders repeatedly. America's industrial base could outproduce Japan tenfold, and any war would inevitably grind Japan into exhaustion. Yet when his nation chose the path of war, Yamamoto bowed to duty and devised the very plan, Pearl Harbor, that would commit Japan to the struggle he dreaded. His loyalty to country and emperor outweighed his personal doubts. This contradiction fascinated historians. Was Yamamoto a tragic Cassandra, doomed to foresee disaster but unable to prevent it? Or was he an architect of destruction who chose brilliance over restraint? His education in the United States, his respect for American culture, and his first-hand knowledge of its factories and universities made him uniquely aware of Japan's limits. Yet his genius for surprise and maneuver compelled him to gamble on daring blows to offset those limits. Pearl Harbor and the subsequent campaigns bore his signature, shocks designed to buy time. When the shocks failed to cripple the enemy, time turned against Japan. For the United States, Operation Vengeance entered legend as one of the most precise acts of retribution in military history. The idea that American codebreakers could pinpoint Yamamoto's itinerary and that fighter pilots could strike him down in the skies of Bougainville became a powerful story of technological and tactical superiority. Yet within military and political circles, debates persisted about the morality of the act. Was targeting an individual commander assassination or legitimate warfare? President Franklin Roosevelt, when approving the mission, had no hesitation. Yamamoto was a uniformed officer in combat, his death a legitimate blow against the enemy's command structure. But some scholars later wondered if the mission foreshadowed a new era of warfare, where leaders themselves became the targets of precision strikes. In Japan, Yamamoto's death was mourned with solemn ceremony. The government declared him a god of war, enshrining him in memory as a martyr for the empire. His ashes were returned to his hometown of Nagaoka, where to this day his legacy is honored with memorials. Yet as post-war Japan remade itself into a democracy, Yamamoto's image evolved. He was no longer seen only as a warrior, but also as a man of tragic foresight, an admiral who understood the futility of the war he was asked to fight. His warning about 6 months of running wild became prophetic shorthand for Japan's fleeting victories and inevitable defeat. Among his surviving officers, reflections on Yamamoto often carried a tone of reverence mixed with regret. Many recalled his tireless work ethic, his keen intellect, and his charisma in inspiring loyalty. Yet they also acknowledged that his strategies, while brilliant in conception, had underestimated the resilience and resourcefulness of his enemy. Pearl Harbor had awakened not just American anger, but American resolve. The strike that Yamamoto designed to neutralize America had instead bound it together with unshakable unity. In the United States, Yamamoto's image shifted with time. Immediately after Pearl Harbor, he was cast as the sinister mastermind behind treachery. But after the war, when his diaries and letters became known, Americans saw a more complex figure. Here was a man who admired Abraham Lincoln, who played poker with Harvard classmates, who expressed regret at leading Japan into a fight he doubted could be won. This nuanced portrait softened his reputation, turning him into one of the few Japanese commanders respected by his former enemies. Operation Vengeance itself became a case study in military academies worldwide. It illustrated the power of signals intelligence, the role of deception, and the impact of targeting leadership. For cryptologists, it was proof that endless hours of number crunching could alter the course of battle. For strategists, it was evidence that eliminating a single individual could destabilize an entire command structure. And for ethicists, it raised timeless questions. Should leaders be hunted or protected as guarantors of order in war? As the Cold War dawned, the lessons of Yamamoto's death reverberated in new forms. The precision strike against a high-value target foreshadowed the modern era of targeted killings, drone warfare, and surveillance-driven operations. The secrecy that had surrounded Operation Vengeance gave way, in time, to open acknowledgement that wars of the future would hinge as much on information as on firepower. Yamamoto, who built his war plan on surprise, had been undone by surprise, a bitter irony that would echo through generations of military study. Today, the memory of Yamamoto bridges two worlds. In Japan, he is remembered as a son of Nagaoka, a naval genius and a reluctant warrior. In the United States, he is remembered as the mind behind Pearl Harbor and the victim of one of history's most daring ambushes. His legacy is thus split, reflecting the very contradictions of his life. Admired yet condemned, brilliant yet doomed, respected yet destroyed by the forces he helped unleash. In the final measure, Yamamoto's story is less about vengeance than about inevitability. He embodied the paradox of a man caught between duty and foresight, loyalty and doubt. His death over Bougainville was not merely the silencing of an enemy commander, it was the closing of a chapter in which war was still thought to be governed by secrecy, surprise, and individual genius. The world that followed would be governed instead by systems of intelligence, by industrial might, and by the relentless logic of total war. The breakthrough came on April 13, 1943, when American codebreakers in the Pacific decrypted a message from the Japanese Navy's JN-25D code. Buried in strings of 5-digit groups was an itinerary so specific it stunned the officers who read it. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, planned an inspection tour of Japanese air bases in the Northern Solomons. The report listed exact times, routes, and aircraft involved. America now knew where its greatest naval adversary would be, down to the minute. Admiral Chester Nimitz, upon receiving the intercept, grasped its significance immediately. It was passed to Washington, where President Franklin Roosevelt gave the order without hesitation. Get Yamamoto. The strike would not only avenge Pearl Harbor, but also deal a psychological blow to the Japanese Navy at a time when the Solomons campaign hung in the balance. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the task fell to the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 347th Fighter Group. Major John W. Mitchell was chosen to lead. His men were told little, only that their target was an important officer. In truth, security was so tight that even most commanders were unaware who the intended victim was. The Americans could not risk the Japanese realizing their codes had been broken. The only aircraft capable of reaching Bougainville and returning was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its long range and twin engines. 16 Lightnings were modified with extra fuel tanks and briefed for a mission unlike any they had flown before. A 1,000-mile round trip over open ocean, navigating by compass and dead reckoning, timed to intercept Yamamoto's bomber precisely at 0935. They would fly at wave-top height to avoid detection, climb only at the last moment, strike, and return home. At dawn on April 18, 1943, Mitchell's squadron lifted into the grey Pacific sky. The formation skimmed above the water at 50 feet, engines humming steadily, every man calculating fuel in his head. There was no room for error. A degree off course, a minute too early or too late, and the entire mission would fail. At 0934, right on schedule, they spotted 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, glinting silver against the dark jungle of Bougainville. 6 Zero escorts wheeled overhead. The American formation broke apart as Mitchell radioed the call. Bogies sighted. Lieutenant Rex Barber pressed his throttle forward, diving at the lead bomber. Yamamoto's plane. His P-38's 4.50 caliber guns and 20mm cannons spat fire. Tracers ripped into the Betty's right engine, then the cockpit. Witnesses saw flames engulf the fuselage before it cartwheeled into the jungle canopy. The crash split trees and sent smoke curling into the morning sky. The admiral who had ordered Pearl Harbor was dead, still strapped to his seat. The second Betty tried to escape, but was pursued by Lieutenant Thomas Lanphier and other lightnings. Damaged by gunfire, it ditched into the sea, killing most aboard. The Zero escorts fought fiercely, but the P-38s held the advantage in speed and firepower. Within minutes, the fight was over. Mitchell rallied his men and turned for Guadalcanal, their fuel gauges nearly empty. Several landed with engines sputtering on dry tanks, but all but one pilot made it back alive. The news was celebrated quietly in U.S. headquarters, but kept secret from the public. To protect the code-breaking operation, officials claimed Yamamoto had been killed in routine combat. The truth, that his schedule had been read from JN-25, remained hidden until after the war. For Japan, Yamamoto's death was devastating. Search teams found his body still seated in the wreckage, his sword by his side, white-gloved hands resting calmly. His loss shook the morale of the Navy. The admiral who had embodied both daring and discipline, who alone could inspire unity among rival officers, was gone. Though successors took command, none possessed his charisma or strategic brilliance. For the Americans, Operation Vengeance became legend within the squadrons that flew it. Debate later raged over who fired the fatal rounds, Barber or Lanphier, but the mission's success was never in doubt. It demonstrated the fusion of signals intelligence and precision air power in a way no operation before it had done. Yamamoto's own prophecy had come true. He had warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but beyond that, America's industrial and strategic power would decide the war. His death, delivered through broken codes and disciplined flying, marked the end of Japan's initiative in the Pacific. From that day forward, the empire was on the defensive. The death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto reverberated across the Pacific like a thunderclap. For Japan, it was a wound deeper than the loss of a commander. It was the extinguishing of the empire's most brilliant naval strategist, a man whose name had become synonymous with both triumph and tragedy. For the United States, his end represented not only vengeance for Pearl Harbor, but also validation of a new kind of warfare. One waged as much with pencils, ciphers, and intercepts as with guns and bombs. Yet the true story of how Yamamoto had been hunted remained cloaked in secrecy. Publicly, Washington maintained the fiction that he had been killed in routine combat, the product of chance encounter rather than deliberate assassination. Only a handful of men, Roosevelt, Nimitz, and the intelligence officers of Station HYPO, knew that the Admiral's itinerary had been lifted from JN-25D, the supposedly impregnable code of the Imperial Japanese Navy. For the cryptanalysts who had laboured in stifling rooms over endless strings of numbers, Yamamoto's death was proof that their unseen war was decisive. Still, they could not boast. Their victory had to remain silent to preserve the advantage. News of Yamamoto's death reached Tokyo on May 21, 1943. The government announced it solemnly, cloaking the event in ritual and reverence. His body, cremated on Bougainville, was transported to Japan and interred with full military honours. The emperor himself attended the funeral, a rare gesture underscoring Yamamoto's status. In death, he was elevated to the rank of Marshal Admiral and enshrined as a Shinto kami, a war deity. Newspapers and broadcasts declared him a martyr whose spirit would guide Japan to victory. But behind the veil of ceremony, the Navy was shaken. Yamamoto had been the glue that held the fractious officer corps together. His successors, Admiral Minachi Koga and later Admiral Suemu Toyoda, were capable men, but neither possessed Yamamoto's charisma or his ability to bridge rival factions. Morale faltered. Officers who had once followed Yamamoto with unwavering confidence now debated strategy with less unity, and Japanese naval planning lost its daring edge. Among ordinary sailors, Yamamoto's death was a spiritual blow. The man who had promised victory, who had inspired with his calm authority, was gone. Survivors of the Bougainville search recalled finding his body still upright in the cockpit, katana at his side, his white-gloved hands folded in what looked like serenity. The image became mythic, a symbol of stoic sacrifice. But myths could not substitute for leadership. In the United States, the secrecy surrounding Operation Vengeance was carefully maintained during the war. Pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron were celebrated, but their mission was presented as a daring interception, not the culmination of months of code-breaking. The truth emerged only after Japan's surrender, when Allied intelligence officers revealed how deeply JN-25 had been penetrated. For Admiral Nimitz, Yamamoto's death was both a relief and a risk. Strategically, it weakened Japan's capacity to coordinate its fleet. But Nimitz also worried about escalation. Targeting enemy leaders carried ethical questions. Was it assassination or legitimate combat? Roosevelt had judged Yamamoto a uniformed commander in the field, and thus fair game. Yet the precedent was unsettling. Wars, traditionally fought between armies and fleets, had taken a step toward precision strikes against individuals. Within the Army Air Forces, Operation Vengeance became a case study in long-range interception, navigation, and timing. Military academies dissected the mission for decades, noting its reliance on precise intelligence and flawless execution. Debate lingered over who deserved credit for the kill, Lieutenant Thomas Lanphier or Lieutenant Rex Barber, but the larger point remained. Intelligence, not luck, had made the mission possible. For the codebreakers of Station HYPO and the Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, Yamamoto's death validated their painstaking work. Men like Commander Joseph Rochefort, Jasper Holmes and their colleagues had fought not with rifles but with slide rules and typewriters. They had endured skepticism from Washington, political infighting, and the daily grind of decrypting 5-digit groups. Operation Vengeance was their triumph, though they could not claim it publicly. After the war, Rochefort was never fully recognized during his lifetime, his contributions overshadowed by bureaucratic rivalries. Only in later decades did the Navy acknowledge that without his team's work, Midway and Operation Vengeance would not have been possible. The cryptologic war, once secret, became celebrated as the hidden edge of Allied victory. In post-war Japan, Yamamoto's image underwent transformation. At first he was remembered as a martyr, his death enshrined in official ceremony. But as Japan rebuilt under peace, a more complex portrait emerged. Historians highlighted his opposition to the Tripartite Pact, his warnings against war with America, and his respect for Western culture. He became a tragic figure, the reluctant warrior bound by duty to execute a war he did not believe in. His prophecy of running wild for 6 months became a national metaphor for hubris and fate. In the United States, Yamamoto's memory softened over time. Once vilified as the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, he came to be respected as a formidable adversary. His Harvard education, his fascination with American culture, and his candid assessments of Japan's chances humanized him. American veterans who had fought his forces often spoke of him with a grudging respect, acknowledging that he was both brilliant and bound by obligations larger than himself. Yamamoto's death carried a broader lesson. The battlefields of the Pacific demonstrated that wars were no longer decided solely by fleets and armies, but by the invisible domain of information. Midway had been won because of broken codes. Bougainville had been the stage for Yamamoto's end because of intercepted signals. The war in the Pacific foreshadowed a future where intelligence would drive operations, where leaders could be targeted with precision, and where the advantage lay not merely in firepower, but in knowledge. From the Cold War to the age of satellites and cyber warfare, the principles born in the basement of Station HYPO lived on. To know the enemy's plans in advance was to seize the initiative. To deny that possibility, as Yamamoto had done, was to court disaster. Yamamoto's life remains a study in contradiction. He admired America, yet struck it. He foresaw defeat, yet planned audacious offensives. He distrusted war with the West, yet became its fiercest executor. His end, brought about by the very intelligence he dismissed, was both fitting and tragic. In the forest of Bougainville, where his bomber fell, locals still remember the crash site as sacred ground. The rusting fragments of the Betty lie entwined with jungle roots, a silent reminder of a moment when fate and war intersected. Visitors leave offerings, not to celebrate vengeance, but to honor a man whose death marked a turning point in history. Admiral Yamamoto once wrote, "If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." His prophecy proved true. The empire he served ran wild, but America's resilience and intelligence turned the tide. His death, born of broken codes, symbolized the transition from Japan's fleeting ascendancy to its long retreat. In the end, Yamamoto was not undone by superior numbers or greater firepower. He was undone by words, intercepted, decrypted, and understood. The man who built his strategy on secrecy and surprise became the most famous victim of intelligence in modern warfare. And in that lies his legacy, a reminder that no code is unbreakable, no leader untouchable, and no war immune to the power of information.